Somewhere in the deep past of the Carolina Low Country lies the disturbing evidence of a truth too horrific for official records. The screams that echoed through an abandoned barn in Rutherford County, North Carolina, on an October morning in 1841, were later documented to have lasted for exactly 14 hours and 23 minutes. Records that mysteriously vanished from the courthouse archives in 1923. Tonight we reveal the complete, unfiltered account of what local authorities deemed too horrific for public knowledge. The story of Ruth Coleman in the most calculated, methodical act of vengeance ever recorded in the antebellum South. At the age of 24, after 7 years of unspeakable cruelty at the hands of her master, William Crenshaw, Ruth finally broke. Her actions would shock even the hardened men who discovered the scene days later, sealing a truth that has been hidden for over a century and 80 years. What we are about to reveal comes from recently discovered personal letters, medical examiner notes, and testimony sealed by court order, evidence confirming how one woman's breaking point led to the ultimate act of vengeance. Make sure you are subscribed to the Forgotten Liturgy to never miss these hidden chapters of American history. In 1841, Rutherford County, North Carolina, was dominated by tobacco. The rolling hills provided the perfect terrain for the golden leaf, creating immense wealth for a few while rendering others entirely expendable. The landscape was dotted with small farms worked by enslaved hands who, in some areas, outnumbered their owners 3-to-1, making it a powder keg of tension beneath a fragile facade of Southern hospitality. The Crenshaw farm was located on a particularly isolated stretch of land, 7 miles from its nearest neighbor. The owner, William Crenshaw, a 38-year-old man consumed by rage and disappointment, had inherited the property and its 12 enslaved people in 1832. Crenshaw's crops consistently underperformed, his attempts at cotton failed, and the death of his wife in 1837 left him alone with his fury and his absolute unchecked power. Crenshaw was a man who stood 6 feet tall, physically imposing with hands calloused from years of physical labor. Yet his defining features were his cold gray eyes that seemed to constantly search for fault. He was something far worse than merely a demanding master. Ruth Coleman was born on the property in 1817, the daughter of the house servant Sarah Coleman. Following the death of Crenshaw's wife when Ruth was 17, she was moved from the fieldwork into the main house. She was intelligent, capable, and had learned to read and manage accounts from the Crenshaw children, skills that, instead of being valued, became a target for Crenshaw's deep-seated resentment. While other enslaved individuals on the property, like Moses, the 52-year-old senior slave, developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate Crenshaw's moods by strategically staying away from the main house, Ruth, working inside, had no such escape route. The abuse began with harsh criticism and impossible standards. Hours spent polishing silver were dismissed as tarnished, and carefully prepared meals were rejected with accusations of improper seasoning. The verbal assaults soon escalated, becoming meaner and more personal, attacking not just her work, but her very existence. William Crenshaw's cruelty was utterly methodical and designed to ensure functionality while maximizing pain. He never struck Ruth where marks would be visible to guests, nor did he damage her hands, which were essential for her household work. Instead, he inflicted physical pain through kicks to her lower back that left her aching for days, twisted arms that would throb whenever she lifted anything heavy, and slaps across her shoulders that stung but left no lasting marks. The psychological torture was even more insidious. Crenshaw would dangle small hopes, the chance to visit her mother, the offer of better food, only to snatch them away, sometimes forcing her to watch him feed the food to his dogs. He studied her reactions, learning exactly which hopes to raise and crush for maximum emotional damage. The death of Ruth's mother, Sarah, in the winter of 1840, left her completely isolated. By the spring of 1841, Ruth had fundamentally changed. She moved through her tasks with a mechanical efficiency, her face a careful mask revealing nothing. But a far more significant transformation was occurring inside her. Ruth was learning to hate with a purity and focus that frightened even her. She began to study Crenshaw the way he had studied her, cataloging his habits, weaknesses, and fears. She noted his fear of fire, his slight limp favoring his left leg, and stored away every humiliation and blow, like ammunition for a war she hadn't yet decided to fight. The breaking point arrived with the deceptive quiet of an ordinary Tuesday morning, October 15th, 1841. The tobacco harvest was nearing completion, and William Crenshaw had been in a particularly foul mood for weeks, raging against disappointing yields and blaming everyone from the soil to the workers, but most intensely, blaming Ruth Coleman for existing as a constant reminder of his failures. Ruth had learned to move through the house with absolute silence, her every action calibrated to minimize provocation. She had prepared his breakfast of eggs, bacon, and cornbread exactly to his rigid specifications, with strong, hot coffee, creating a scene that was technically perfect, which often signaled in her experience that catastrophe was imminent. Crenshaw appeared in the kitchen at 6:30 a.m. Finding no fault in the breakfast layout, his cold gray eyes turned to Ruth herself. "Your hair looks like a bird's nest," he sneered, his voice edged with the search for an excuse. "Did you even attempt to make yourself presentable this morning?" Ruth kept her eyes down, offering a quick apology and moving to the mirror to smooth her hair, while behind her Crenshaw ate aggressively. After several minutes of silence, he announced, "The eggs are overcooked." Ruth turned, confusion genuine on her face, knowing she had cooked them precisely as trained. "Sir, I prepared them the same way as always," she tried to explain. The plate exploded against the wall 6 inches from Ruth's head, eggs and bacon scattering everywhere, followed by the deadly quiet of Crenshaw's voice. "Are you questioning my judgment? Are you telling me that I don't know my own preferences?" Ruth immediately dropped to her knees, her hands shaking slightly as she began collecting the broken ceramic and scattered food. Crenshaw stood up, his boots crunching on the fragments, watching her clean the mess he had created. In that moment, 7 years of accumulated rage and frustration reached a critical mass in his mind. He watched Ruth on her hands and knees and convinced himself she was the source of his problems. The failed crops, the isolation, the constant reminder of his inadequacy. It was time she understood the trouble she had caused. "Stand up," he ordered. Ruth rose slowly, clutching the broken pieces of the plate. "Put that down and follow me." Her stomach clenched with familiar dread. An outdoor summons meant a punishment he didn't want witnessed from within the house. The crisp October air and heavy dew soaked her thin cotton dress as they walked across the yard toward the largest barn, a structure thick with the sweet, dusty smell of drying tobacco leaves and the metallic scent of farm tools. Inside the dim barn, Crenshaw stopped by the complex pulley system used to lift heavy bales. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice echoing slightly. "You think I don't see the way you look at me, the way you judge me?" Ruth remained silent, knowing there was no safe response. Crenshaw began pacing, his boots loud against the dirt floor. "7 years I've fed you, clothed you, given you a place to live. And how do you repay me? With disrespect? With incompetence? With that look in your eyes like you think you're better than me?" He grabbed a thick length of rope from the pulley system, testing its strength with a sharp tug. For the first time that morning, the real, cutting fear broke through Ruth's composure. "String you up for a few hours," Crenshaw continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone he reserved for planning his most cruel punishments. The word that finally shattered Ruth's control was grateful. 7 years of beatings, 7 years of humiliation, 7 years of being told she should be grateful for the privilege of being tortured. The controlled anger suddenly roared to the surface with a force that surprised even her. "Grateful," the word escaped her lips. Crenshaw froze, the rope still in his hands. "What did you say?" Ruth raised her head and looked directly into his eyes for the first time in months. "I said, grateful." Crenshaw's face darkened with a rage beyond anything Ruth had seen before. He dropped the rope and lunged toward her, his hands curling into fists. "You ungrateful piece of—" Ruth moved faster than she had ever moved in her life. As Crenshaw came forward, she sidestepped and pushed against his back with all her strength, sending him stumbling toward the wooden support beam. His shoulder struck the beam hard, and as he spun around, Ruth was already grabbing the heavy wooden mallet used for repairs. She swung it twice toward the rope mechanism controlling the main cross beam overhead. The first blow loosened the knot. The second sent the entire structure cascading down. Crenshaw raised his arms protectively just as the massive 300-pound beam crashed down at an angle, missing his head but catching his legs just below the knees. The sound was a terrible combination of splintering wood, crushing bone, and William Crenshaw's agonizing scream that seemed to go on forever. When the dust settled, William Crenshaw lay pinned beneath the fallen beam, his legs twisted at impossible angles, but he was conscious, staring up at Ruth with wide eyes. "Help me," he whispered, panic creeping in as he tried unsuccessfully to move the beam. Ruth stood perfectly still, the mallet in her hands, recognizing that the balance of power that had defined her entire adult life had completely reversed. "You want me to help you?" she asked, her voice almost conversational. "Yes, please. We can work something out. I can change. I promise I can change." Ruth knelt down beside him. For the first time in 7 years, William Crenshaw was looking at her as if she were a human being whose opinion mattered. "I don't think I will," she said quietly. The desperate hope in Crenshaw's eyes transformed into a terrifying realization. His fate was entirely in the hands of the woman he had tormented. At that moment, Ruth Coleman's real revenge began. To understand its magnitude, one must understand what 7 years of abuse had taught her about inflicting suffering with surgical precision. Crenshaw had been an expert in psychological torture, and Ruth had been his unwilling student. She had learned that anticipation was worse than the blow, and that small kindnesses strategically placed could make subsequent cruelties exponentially devastating. Now, with Crenshaw helpless, Ruth possessed the knowledge she needed. "My legs," Crenshaw gasped. "I can't feel my legs. You have to get help. Get Moses. Get the others. They can lift this thing off me." Ruth examined the situation with the same careful attention she used to prepare his meals. The beam had crushed his legs, but he was not in immediate danger of bleeding out. "Moses is in the far fields today," she said matter-of-factly, standing up to walk slowly around the fallen beam. "He won't be back until evening. The others are with him." Crenshaw begged her to take the horse to town to fetch Dr. Harrison. Ruth stopped, looking down at him. "You know, in 7 years, you've never once said please to me when you weren't in pain. It's interesting how quickly that changes when circumstances shift." As Crenshaw pleaded, attempting to backtrack, Ruth's voice remained calm but with a terrible undertone. "Let me tell you what I think you've done, Master Crenshaw. I think you've broken 3 of my ribs. I think you've dislocated my shoulder twice. I think you've called me stupid approximately 2,000 times." She began walking again, examining the tools in the barn. "I think you've destroyed food I spent hours preparing, because you enjoyed watching me realize that nothing I could do would ever be good enough for you. But mostly, I think you've made me believe that I deserved all of it." Crenshaw quickly offered to make it right. "I can give you your freedom. I can give you money, land, whatever you want." Ruth laughed, a sound holding no humor. "My freedom? You think freedom is something you can give me? You think it's yours to give?" She knelt down beside the beam, picking up a small crowbar and positioning it near some debris by his left leg. "I want to tell you a story, Master Crenshaw," she said, her voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. "About a little girl who used to believe that if she was good enough, smart enough, helpful enough, maybe the man who owned her would treat her with kindness." Crenshaw tried to nod through the pain. "That little girl tried so hard," Ruth continued. "She learned to read. She learned to cook. She managed a household better than most free women. And do you know what happened to that little girl, Master Crenshaw? She learned that none of it mattered. She learned that to some people her very existence was an offense worthy of punishment." Ruth continued her quiet discourse, explaining that the little girl, the one who believed her intelligence and competence would earn kindness, had died. She learned that her intelligence was threatening, her competence was embarrassing, and her hope was something to be systematically destroyed. Ruth then began using the crowbar, but instead of freeing Crenshaw, she was methodically making his situation worse. Each piece of wood and metal she pried loose was repositioned to add subtle weight and pressure to different parts of his trapped legs. "So, that little girl died?" Ruth continued conversationally. She died slowly over 7 years until all that was left was someone who understood exactly how much pain one person could inflict on another. Crenshaw's breathing grew ragged as the pain intensified, but Ruth's repositioning was carefully managed, ensuring he was not in immediate danger of bleeding to death. "The thing is," Ruth said, examining her work, "I learned from the best. I learned from someone who understood that the anticipation of pain is often worse than pain itself. Someone who knew that hope, properly managed, could be turned into a weapon." She stood up and returned with a small wooden bucket and ladle. "I'm going to get you some water," she announced, "because you're going to be here for a while and I wouldn't want you to die of thirst before we're finished." She allowed him to drink deeply from the ladle, and for a moment, genuine gratitude flickered in his eyes. Ruth immediately withdrew the ladle. "Finished with your education," she said. "You see, for 7 years, you've been teaching me about power, about what happens when one person has complete control over another person's life. I was an excellent student, Master Crenshaw. Probably the best student you ever had." She then moved the bucket just out of his reach. The true horror of Ruth's plan began to unfold as the morning sun sent shafts of light through the barn walls. Ruth positioned herself on a small wooden stool 6 feet away, a safe vantage point from which she could monitor his condition. "I've been thinking about this moment for a very long time," she said, maintaining her terrifyingly conversational tone. Crenshaw pleaded, "Ruth, you have to understand, I never meant—" Ruth held up one finger, almost gently. "It's my turn to talk now. You've had 7 years to say whatever you wanted to say. Today we're going to reverse those roles." She withdrew a small piece of folded paper from her dress pocket. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "This is a list," Ruth said, carefully unfolding the document, covered in small, neat handwriting and faded ink. "I started writing it 3 years ago when I realized that my memory wasn't good enough to keep track of everything. Every time you hurt me, I wrote it down. Every cruel word, every blow, every humiliation, I kept a record." Ruth began to read in the same tone she might have used for a grocery list. January 15th, 1839. Twisted my left arm behind my back until my shoulder popped for dropping a spoon. Called me clumsy and said clumsiness deserved punishment. She continued, cataloging years of systematic abuse with clinical precision. March 3rd, 1840. Slapped me across the face for crying when I learned my mother was sick. Said that tears were selfish because they made other people uncomfortable. She watched Crenshaw, noting the moments when recognition flickered in his eyes. August 12th, 1840. Made me stand outside in the rain for 2 hours after I asked if I could visit my mother before she died. Said that asking for privileges showed ingratitude. "Do you remember that one?" she asked, folding the list. "Yes, she died that night while I was standing in your yard soaking wet, learning about gratitude. She died calling my name, and I wasn't there because you thought I needed to understand my place." Ruth walked to a corner of the barn and selected a pair of long-handled pliers. "That was the night I started keeping the list," she continued, "because I realized that someday, somehow, there would have to be an accounting. Not justice from courts or laws. Real justice. Personal justice." She returned to her position near Crenshaw. "Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to work on getting you free from under that beam, slowly, carefully. And while I work, you're going to apologize for every single thing on my list. Every entry gets an apology, a real one, where you admit what you did and why it was wrong." Crenshaw immediately grasped at the hope. Yes, of course. I'll apologize for everything. I'm truly sorry for all of it." Ruth smiled, an expression more terrifying than her anger. "Oh, that's not how this works," she said softly. "See, I learned from you that apologies given under duress aren't really apologies at all. They're just words people say to make pain stop. No, your apologies have to be earned. For each entry on my list, you have to experience something equivalent to what you put me through. That's only fair, don't you think?" Crenshaw's eyes widened in dawning horror. "You can't, Ruth. You can't do this. This isn't who you are." "You're right," Ruth agreed pleasantly. "This isn't who I was, But you spent 7 years teaching me to be someone else. Did you think I wasn't paying attention? She adjusted her grip on the pliers and applied pressure to a sharp piece of metal that was pressing against Crenshaw's already traumatized right leg, sending fresh waves of agony through him. Let's start with entry number 1, Ruth said, returning to her stool and opening the folded paper again. January 15th, 1839, the dropped spoon incident. The torture that followed was methodical, creative, and born from an intimate understanding of human psychology that only years of systematic brutalization could impart. Ruth had not only learned about physical pain, but also the particular cruelty of hope repeatedly offered and withdrawn. For each entry on her list, Ruth applied a corresponding lesson. The man who had twisted her arm found his own arm pinned beneath debris, creating constant, agonizing pressure. The man who had kicked her for moving slowly now discovered what it felt like to be completely unable to move while desperately needing to escape his situation. Ruth's most diabolical innovation was her use of water. Every 30 minutes, like clockwork, she would bring the ladle to Crenshaw's lips, allowing him to drink deeply. The water was always cool, always clean, always exactly what his body desperately needed. And each time, as he drank gratefully, she would tell him that his cooperation was earning this kindness. "You see how much better things can be when we treat each other with respect," she would say, her voice gentle and caring. "This is what kindness looks like, Master Crenshaw." Then she would return to her systematic infliction of pain, ensuring Crenshaw understood the water was merely another form of psychological torture, designed to make the subsequent cruelty exponentially more devastating. As the hours passed, Ruth worked through the list, demanding apologies that lacked sincerity be repeated until Crenshaw demonstrated proper remorse. She discovered Crenshaw was terrified of insects, a phobia he had managed to hide for years. The barn was full of spiders and beetles, and Ruth used this knowledge with surgical precision, guiding large spiders near his face and hands. "My mother was afraid too," Ruth would whisper as a large spider crossed Crenshaw's forehead. "She was afraid of dying alone, afraid that I had forgotten about her. Can you imagine what that fear felt like?" By midday, Crenshaw began to break down completely, reduced to a creature of pure desperation. He begged, sobbed, and promised impossible things. "I'll free you. I'll free everyone. I'll help you go north. Just please make this stop." Ruth paused, her eyes cold. "Do you know what you sound like?" she asked. "You sound exactly like me 7 years ago, when I was begging you to stop hurting me." She reminded him of his own words. "You told me that begging was undignified. You told me that accepting my situation with grace would serve me better than pleading for mercy I hadn't earned. You told me that pain was a teacher." Ruth smoothed down her dress, a sickeningly domestic gesture. "So, I'm going to give you the same advice you gave me. Accept your situation with grace, Master Crenshaw. Be grateful for the lessons you're learning, and stop begging because it's undignified." As the afternoon sun began to descend, Ruth, showing no signs of fatigue, continued her work. She seemed energized by the suffering, as if each moment of Crenshaw's agony was feeding something in her that had been starved for 7 years. When he slipped into unconsciousness, she applied just enough stimulus to bring him back. "Stay with me," she would say. "We are not finished yet. You can't leave until we've completed your education." But Ruth was also changing. She found herself studying Crenshaw's reactions with scientific curiosity, making mental notes on the effectiveness of her techniques. "I never understood before why you seem to enjoy hurting me so much," she mused aloud, kneeling beside his head. "I always thought it was just anger or frustration. But it's not, is it? It's about control. It's about the moment when someone realizes that their entire existence depends on your whim." She realized that Crenshaw had created his own executioner. "You took a frightened girl and turned her into someone who understands cruelty better than you ever did." Ruth stood and looked out at the fields. "They won't come looking for you," she told Crenshaw, the truth of his isolation hitting him with fresh horror. "Moses knows better than to disturb you when you're disciplining me. They've learned to stay away when they hear screaming from the barn." His own systematic abuse had ensured his complete isolation. "So, we have all the time we need," Ruth concluded, returning to her stool. "No interruptions, no rescue. Now, where were we?" Ah, yes. August 30th, 1840. You made me burn my own letters. The letters had been Ruth's most precious possessions, the silent testament to her inner life that Crenshaw hadn't yet destroyed. These were letters she had written but never sent to her dying mother, pouring out her fears, her dreams, and the fragments of hope that sustained her. Crenshaw had discovered them in August 1840 and was enraged, not by treason, but by the undeniable evidence of her humanity. He forced Ruth to build a fire and watch, one by one, as he read selected passages aloud in a mocking parody of her voice, laughing as the paper crumbled into ash. "You forgot your place," he had sneered as the last letter burned. "You started thinking of yourself as a person instead of property. All this self-indulgent emotional nonsense. It's not natural for someone like you." Now, over a year later, Ruth looked down at her tormentor. "Do you remember what you said when you made me burn my letters?" she asked. Crenshaw could barely whisper, "Please, no more." Ruth continued, her voice steady. "You said that the problem with people like me was that we forgot our place. You said we needed constant reminders of what we were and what we weren't." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small bundle of papers. "But you see, I never stopped writing letters. I just got better at hiding them." These new papers were addressed to William Crenshaw, written over the past 3 years as her hatred crystallized into a meticulous plan. "I want to read you one of them," Ruth said, unfolding the topmost sheet, dated just last week. She read, "Dear Master Crenshaw, today you kicked me for spilling flour. As I cleaned up the mess, I imagined what it would feel like to have you helpless beneath me, begging for mercy that I could choose to give or withhold." She met his horrified gaze. "I imagined the look in your eyes when you finally understood that your life depended entirely on my whim. I imagined making you apologize for every cruel word, every blow, the terrible knowledge that nothing you could say or do would change your situation unless I decided to let it change." She folded the letter. "The thing is, Master Crenshaw, when I wrote that letter, it was just a fantasy. I never really believed I would have the chance to make it real. But here we are. And I find that reality is so much more satisfying than fantasy ever was." The final phase of Ruth's revenge was the most methodical yet. She began to systematically remove the debris she had spent hours carefully positioning around Crenshaw's legs. But instead of freeing him, each piece she moved created new pressure points, new sources of agony as the weight of the beam shifted. "You taught me that hope was the cruelest torture of all," she said as she worked. "Every time you would hint that my situation might improve, only to make it worse instead. Every time you would dangle the possibility of mercy just out of reach." Ruth was orchestrating a symphony of suffering. She would make Crenshaw believe, just for a moment, that she was going to spare him. That if he apologized sincerely enough, she might let him live. "Because that moment when hope dies is the most exquisite pain of all," she whispered. "And you deserve to experience it the way I experienced it every single day for 7 years." As the afternoon wore on, the frightened girl who had entered the barn was gone completely, replaced by someone who moved with purposeful confidence and controlled every aspect of the situation with masterful precision. "Everything that's happened to you today is exactly what you chose for yourself 7 years ago," she stated as the sun began to set. "Every moment of pain, every instant of terror, you created it all when you decided that someone like me didn't deserve to be treated as a human being." Crenshaw, reduced to a creature of pure animal terror, whispered, "This isn't justice. This is murder." "No," Ruth replied calmly, kneeling beside him one final time. "Justice would have been a quick death. Justice would have been you standing trial for your crimes. This isn't justice at all." She looked into his eyes, ensuring he saw her expression clearly. "This is education. I'm teaching you what it feels like to be completely powerless. I'm showing you what 7 years of systematic cruelty does to a person's soul." Ruth withdrew her original list, now stained with sweat and dirt. "One last entry," she announced, writing the final words at the bottom of the page. "October 15th, 1841. William Crenshaw learned what it means to be at the mercy of someone who has no mercy left to give." "There," Ruth said, folding the paper for the final time. Now we're finished. What transpired in the final hour of William Crenshaw's life was never fully documented. According to the few, quickly sealed accounts that survived, Ruth spent those last 60 minutes not inflicting new tortures, but talking. She told Crenshaw about the girl he had destroyed, about the dreams she had once cherished, and the realization that her humanity meant nothing to him. She explained how that realization had hollowed her out, creating a vacuum for something else to grow. "You created me," she said as darkness began to fall. "The person I am now, the person who could do what I've done today. She's your creation as much as mine. You should be proud. It's probably the most successful project you ever completed." As Crenshaw's breathing became labored, Ruth made her final adjustments. The weight distribution that had kept him alive throughout the day was carefully altered, allowing the full pressure of the beam to settle onto his chest and abdomen. "I want you to know that I forgive you," she said as his eyes began to glaze over. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying hatred for 7 years has been exhausting, and I'm ready to put it down." William Crenshaw died at approximately 9:30 that evening, just as Moses and the other field workers were returning from their labor. Ruth met them at the barn door, her face calm. "There's been an accident," she announced, claiming Crenshaw was killed when a support beam fell, and that she was unable to move it alone. Moses, a man who had survived decades of slavery by knowing when not to ask questions, simply nodded and organized the workers to clear the debris. The official investigation was cursory. Crenshaw was buried 3 days later. The Crenshaw property was sold 6 weeks after the funeral. Ruth, along with the other enslaved individuals, was purchased by Thomas Garrett, a neighboring farmer known for fair treatment. Under Garrett's ownership, Ruth resumed her life, performing her duties with the same quiet efficiency. But those who knew her noticed a change. Ruth smiled more readily, spoke with greater confidence, and carried herself with an unshakable dignity. She never mentioned the events of October 15, 1841. The truth remained buried until 1923, when renovations at the old Rutherford County Courthouse uncovered a collection of sealed documents hidden behind a false wall in the basement. Among these was a detailed confession written in Ruth Coleman's distinctive handwriting, along with the complete list of grievances she had maintained for 7 years. The document explained her methods, motivations, and complete lack of remorse, concluding with a chilling paragraph. "I write this account not as a confession of guilt, but as a record of justice finally served. William Crenshaw spent 7 years teaching me that some people are born to suffer, while others are born to inflict suffering. Today I proved him wrong. Today I showed him that the roles can be reversed. I regret nothing that happened in that barn, because for the first time in 7 years, the world was exactly as fair as it should be." The documents were quickly resealed, deemed too inflammatory, and were eventually destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1963. But the story survived in whispered conversations and family legends. Ruth Coleman lived for another 37 years after Crenshaw's death, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1878, at the age of 61. She never spoke publicly about the event, but those who knew her in her later years described her as a woman of remarkable inner peace, someone who had settled all her accounts with the world. Local legend claims her gravestone bears the words, "She remembered everything, and she settled every debt." Ruth Coleman's story is one of the most disturbing examples of how systematic cruelty can transform victims into something their oppressors never intended to create. It reminds us that the line between victim and victimizer is often thinner than we like to believe, and that justice, when denied by law and society, will sometimes find its own terrible way into the world. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Ruth was justified in her actions, or did she become the very thing she fought against? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts with others who are trying to understand this dark chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that reveal the hidden darkness in our nation's past, subscribe to The Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex moral questions that history forces us to confront.